Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about The Lost Future of Pepperharrow by Natasha Pulley. So, it's rare to find a sequel that lives up to the first book, and that's why it took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to pick up this book, because I loved the first one so much that I was really afraid that this one would just sort of tarnish it. And I'd say, no, this one lives up to the first book. So this is the sequel to The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, and it is one of the rare sequels that I honestly feel like stands alone strongly enough that you could read this one without having read the first if you wanted to for whatever reason. But in this book we follow Thaniel, now a civil servant working for the British Foreign Office in London. We start the story with him not in great shape. First of all, his lover, Maury, has been away for months, organizing something, because that's what Maury does. Maury can remember the future, and so he is almost constantly slightly shifting things to try to produce a better future. And on top of which, Thaniel is sick. He has had this lingering cough that will not go away, and is only made worse by the incredibly heavy, noxious London fog. Now, to make things even worse, one day he shows up at the office and is told that he is being sent away. The British Legion in Tokyo, which is like an embassy but smaller, is having trouble with ghosts, and they want Thaniel to go over there and find out what's going on and hopefully fix the problem. And they're sending him there for a year. But then Maury reappears out of pretty much nowhere, just in time to join him on this trip. And it starts to look like maybe this was part of Maury's plan. But what is this plan for? Is it to start a war, to stop a war, to save Thaniel? Or is Thaniel the sacrifice to save the world? But I loved this book. This is one of those books that very much, I'm not even sure where to start talking about it, because all I really feel is just like, oh my god, I loved it, it was beautiful. It's full of wonderful lyrical language, it's got inventive magic, intensely human-feeling culture and world building, and of course, what I'm always the most attracted to in a book, it has fabulous characters. First of all, Thaniel is like sweet and complex, and his synesthesia feels like a certain kind of magic in this book, and it sort of does become a superpower in a way. It allows him to see things that he probably would not have if he did not have it. And I love the fact that he has grown both distinctly stronger and weaker since the last book. There feels like there has been a lot of character growth and character development here. But he's also very distinctly the same character I fell in love with in Watchmaker of Filigree Street. And Maury is also fascinating, and I love the way he is both so lovable, gentle, and also strong, and a character that you sort of wonder the entire time if you are actually seeing all that's going on with him, and whether you can actually trust him, and whether the people around him can trust him. Like, he is such an intensely complex character. And the relationship between them is just so sweet. It's honestly one of the sweetest relationships I've ever read in a book. Even though I am not usually fond of stories where two characters in a relationship fail to tell each other the really important stuff, it works perfectly in this book. There are real reasons for them to be silent with each other and for them not to say these incredibly important things. And the release of when they finally do get a chance to say it made me just like squeal out loud from sheer joy. And like, I was so happy I literally was having trouble focusing on the page. And it didn't feel forced, which I feel like often with the reason I don't like this trope of like, oh, characters can't talk to each other, is because it feels like forced so that you can have that emotional release later. Whereas this one, no, it felt like real normal people who were, you know, dealing with the pressure of the world and who are finally working through some really difficult shit to actually progress their relationship. And it's a relationship with very little on-page romance, but that's perfect for the characters. Like, I'm one of those people that, like, I don't need there to be a lot of kissing and loving and spice and all that stuff on page, but it also doesn't bother me in any way. Like, when it's there, I enjoy it. When it's not there, I'm fine with it. But what really matters to me is whether it's authentic to the characters. And I know this is going to sound a little bit ridiculous, but like, if the characters are rather private people, and especially if we're in a close POV, if we start getting explicit stuff on the page, I'm like, that does not feel natural. That feels like we are invading their privacy. And in this particular book, the characters are both two very private people, and they're living in a society that sort of forces them to be even more private. And this is an interesting close POV, because there are times that we are 100% getting emotions and feelings that they would not be telling close friends. But other times the POV really does feel like more like they are just telling their friends this story. And so it would have felt out of place. And also, I will admit, it does make those few moments of on-page romance, the on-page physical contact, so much more powerful and full of emotions. But I also want to go back to characters here. There's also Six. She was a character who appeared in the first book, but she wasn't very important of a character. Like, a lot of people talk about the fact that the first book really only has one female character, and that's forgetting Six, because she's just not such an important character. But in this one, she is Thaniel and Maury's adopted daughter, and so we get to see a hell of a lot more of her. And I love her to death! She's quirky, awkward, poorly socialized, probably in some way neurodivergent, and she hates being touched. She doesn't like dolls, but she loves math and light bulbs. And I love how Thaniel and Maury are with her. Like, I love the fact that we do see Thaniel, like, actively not understanding her feelings a good bit of the time, but also still respecting her, accepting that she knows what she wants and needs, and appreciating both who she is as a person, but also her abilities. And I love the fact that she is shown as very intelligent, but it doesn't ever feel like that cliche, like, oh, she's neurodivergent and a savant. No, she just sounds like and feels like a real intelligent young woman who may be neurodivergent, but it may just be that she grew up with such a bad childhood that she doesn't really know socialization, which presents in a similar kind of way. But I also love the distinctly different relationship she had with the two fathers, because her relationship with Maury and her relationship with Thaniel are very different relationships, and they're both very sweet and loving, and it's lovely. And I also just love the future that she implied in this book. Because children in this book, well, children in all books really, are usually simple shorthand for the possibility of the future. And, like, it's a very simple metaphor. But there's a little bit more complexity to that metaphor going on in this book, because of the clairvoyant element that's in place here. Six's continued presence is not just a continued reassurance that there was a future, and specifically a future for these two, but also it gives people an active reason for them to try to keep surviving and keep working. And she's also a stand-in for home, and the fact that, like, she wasn't just a stereotypical little girl character helped deliver the message that this was not the stereotypical family or the stereotypical home. And overall, like, she's not a super active character in the book. She doesn't do a lot that progresses the plot forward, but she's a very important emotional and metaphorical character in the book. And I just really like the way she was used, and also who she is as a character. I also really appreciate the way Japan was presented in this book. I have absolutely no idea how much of what is in this book is accurate to anyone who knows anything about Japan in the late 1880s. But to me, it was just evocative living, and it felt like it had a huge amount of depth, and most importantly, it felt like it had humanity. Like, a lot of the times, especially when you're looking at books that are featuring cultures that are not the most common European medieval culture that is used in fantasy novels, it feels a little bit like, ooh, look at the exoticism, and this does not feel like that. This feels very human. And there's even a note in the back of the book that talks specifically about how people tend to translate Japanese as this incredibly tensely formal and stiff language. And the author made the active effort to not do that, to instead imbibe the words with the intricacies of tone that exist in that language that are usually left behind. And specifically, what she plays with a lot here is the more rude, childish, playful, more casual tone of it, and just translating it into language that would make sense to an English reader that that's what's going on. And, like, I loved it. It was really well done. A lot of my Temeraire reviews, I talk about the fact that I really appreciate the way Naomi Novik captures the voice of the era that she writes in, but one of the downsides of really capturing a voice like that is that unless your reader is overly familiar with the voice, a lot of the humanity of it can be lost, because it feels theatrical to a modern reader. The way that Japanese is often translated as overly formal. A lot of language from the past has that same effect. And it's like the way that too many people perform Shakespeare all stiff and dramatic and, ooh, I shall pronounce this on the stage because it's high drama, which completely misses the fact that, like, half of all dialogue in Shakespeare plays is just dick jokes. That's all that's going on. Like, it's impressive. And so, in general, we tend to hear slightly archaic language and assume that people are being Jane Austen levels of polite, instead of, quite often, it is being used in a way, like, if you actually go back in time and look at the way these people are talking, they are being rude. It's just, it may not hit on our ears as rude. And it can make people in the past feel sort of other and, like, less human. And it makes it feel often that people from a different time period had different emotions, desires, and dreams. And that can be super interesting in a way of, like, you know, exploring the different morals of different societies from different eras. But it's not always what you want to do. And sometimes what we want is a book that just reminds us that humans are humans no matter what country, era, class, or any other distinction they live in. And using a more modern-sounding tone can do a lot of that work. And I also think that one of the things that allows this book to really do that, to create that modern tone to the language, is the fact that most of the dialogue is presented as having been in Japanese and translated for us. It just frees the author to play around with our expectation. Because it's a translation, even though, truthfully, I'm assuming she wrote it in English and did not go back and write it in Japanese and then translate it. But it's not the actual words that are spoken, so there's no sense to people being like, oh, but would that word have actually existed in the 1889 Japan? Because, no, they wouldn't have been saying piss off in 1889 in Japan. They would have been saying the 1889 Japanese equivalent. And the author is just telling us that that's what that meant. We understand that translation between languages is going to be using different language. And that's not something that we always really understand when we're just translating between time periods within the same language. Like, almost anything set in the past, there is going to be some translation. Like, Naomi Novik in Temeraire, she is not writing exactly what those characters would have said if they were exactly there. She is doing some translation. And we don't really notice it, and we don't really pay attention to it until it goes too far. And that's the moment that we start going, wait, this sounds out of place, this sounds modern. But the fact that this is all sort of double translated added a certain separation that allows you to just have more freedom to express the meaning of the words without having to get the exact tone and voice of the language correct, if any of that made sense. But there's also even some in the text itself, like the book itself talks about translation, and specifically translation between classes. Like, Thaniel spends some time with someone who was born in a much higher class than him, but in England, and he thinks about, like, the translation between these two forms of the same language. And it all really is a fascinating look at the way translation and, you know, presumed translation works in a fantasy novel. But on that note, I do also want to talk about how much this book played with the different kinds of power that people can have. Maury literally, of course, has magic powers, but he also has political clout, nobility, and money. And he can fight. In the first book, Maury is shown as a character who is very dangerous, but only because of his clairvoyance. And in this book, we also get to see the fact that he can physically kick people's ass. And it's a beautiful contrast to the delicate, gentle, and quiet way he's presented most of the time in the story. But it's also just a very interesting way of imbibing this character with even more power. And, like, Thaniel himself also has his own weird kinds of power. Like, I mentioned this, the synesthesia starts to actually feel like a little bit of a superpower at some points. But also, it's really easy to imagine Thaniel as a damsel in distress, someone who's going to be rescued by Maury and by circumstances. And it's clear that Thaniel himself sort of thinks of himself that way, but it's also very clear that he's not. He's a very physically imposing man in this book, and not just because in Japan he's comparatively tall, he's also bulked up from the last book. He also knows how to fight. He knows how to box. And I also love the quiet, subtle surety that he has that gives him this weird power of, like, he understands a lot more of what's going on around him than pretty much anyone else around him. And he is perfectly happy to just calmly correct those who should be his social, political, and governmental superiors. And, like, I'm pretty sure that the reason he has picked up this casual surety that he certainly did not have in the first book is that he has, you know, had a while of having a clairvoyant to back him up. But also, even when he no longer has that, when there are moments in this book that he knows that Maury is not there to back him up, and he may or may not be doing what Maury wants him to do, he still maintains that casual surety because he is just completely solid in his own knowledge of what his skills are, which are, you know, incredibly calm and clear and precise listening, absorbing information, and seeing patterns. And that in itself can be something of a superpower. And it's great getting to see him use that and how he uses that and how that interacts and contrasts with all the other forms of power that he is surrounded by. And when he is weak versus when he is strong, it's all very well done and interesting. I also love the balance of despair and hope we see in this character. Spoiler here, he spends a good portion of the book knowing that he is dying of tuberculosis. And yes, I do find that funny as someone who watches a lot of John Green videos that, yes, tuberculosis pops up everywhere. But it's always sort of there on his mind, but he just keeps going. And part of that is because he is just the no-nonsense kind of person that knows that when there's no other option, you have to keep going no matter what. But also, much of the time, what's going on is he doesn't really give up hope for the future. But it's not necessarily his future. Even when he thinks he's going back to London to a terrible fate or might be dying soon, he is still planning for how to make Six's life better, how to make Maury's life easier, how to fix the things around him. He is at his core a character that knows that the future keeps going beyond him. And he lives his life accordingly, which might be why he fits so well with Maury. But I also really want to talk about the women in this book. So I am not one of those people who looks around for reviews of books that I've read, and especially if I liked them. If I disliked a book, I will look up its reviews to see if I'm, you know, losing my mind here. But that means I specifically did not look up reviews of Watchmaker. But because it's a relatively well-known book, I did see things in passing that people felt about it. And one of the things that I saw from a couple people is that they pointed out that there wasn't exactly great female representation in that book. There really is one female character other than Six, who's a very minor character. And the character that is there is Grace, and she is a very I'm not like other girls kind of character. And spoiler for the first book, she sort of ends up being the antagonist while also not being the antagonist. It's a very complex story. But I personally really loved her as a character, even though I sort of despised her as a person. Like, I didn't always want to switch to her sections of the book. Some of the book is in her POV. but that was because I just didn't want to hang out with her. She wasn't a fun person all the time. But I loved what the author was doing with her. She was a very interesting, different, nuanced kind of character, and she was sort of a response to the trope of not like other girls. And she was complicated, she was not always likable, but she was perfectly understandable. And, like, you knew, even when she was on the wrong side of the fight, you understood why she was doing what she was doing. But the thing is, considering she is pretty much the only main female character in that book, I can get why people could say that that is not the best female representation ever. Especially when, spoiler for that book, she is a cold hard bitch who almost breaks up the hero's relationship, at least partially out of jealousy. But she does appear in this book, and I really like how she was utilized in this book. There's not quite a redemption arc going on here, because she was never really in need of a full redemption. That's not really what's going on here. But it's a continuation of the complex arc that had already started there, and her complex relationships with all the other characters. And this book does have other female characters. Beyond 6, there's one more that I would definitely count as a main character. Like, she is one of the leads. We get sections from her POV. And she's also an intensely complex character. Taikiko is brusque and sometimes mean. She sort of starts out as an understandable antagonist, but doesn't stay in that role. And, like, much of the character revolves around her two very important relationships in her life. Her friendship with Mori and her friendship with another woman who died years ago. And I loved the way her position in the story was meted out to us. It sort of in some ways mirrors Grace, but sort of is doing its own completely different thing. And as a reader, I just kept thinking I knew exactly what role she played in the book, only to have that completely reversed by like 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. She was the titular POV here, so we do get a lot of just not really her voice so much as her presence. And also, unlike Grace, I was never annoyed when we were switching to her POVs, even though she was a morally gray character for a good portion of the book, and for a while it looked like she might be a major antagonist. It wasn't clear. There was just so much going on with her sections that I was innately drawn in. The ending of her arc did come just a little bit too suddenly for my taste, but that's because we were seeing it from Thaniel's point of view. And he was going through some serious shit at the time. He didn't have a lot of time to focus on her emotional arc at that moment. And I do think it was the correct decision to see it from his point of view, just because it makes more sense in the story, but it does rob that moment of just a hair of the depth of emotions that it should have had. But hell, even the true antagonist of this book was surprisingly likable. Even though he was also, frankly, an absolute shithead. Like, he was the perfect level of likable versus unlikable to me for an antagonist. Because, I mean, I'm one of those people, I want a happy ending. I want the antagonist to lose. But if I like him too much, then I don't want him to lose. So it was a perfect balance here. Overall, I keep wanting to say things and then deciding not to because I don't want to spoil even one line of this book. Because I loved it so much. But I do want to talk about the magic very briefly. I almost feel guilty calling it magic because the author did such a good, solid job of making it feel scientifically plausible, even when it really wasn't. But there's also just these perfect small hints and moments that make it clear that it is truly magical, not scientific. Like the owls. They are explained, but the explanation, like, goes nowhere near explaining everything of what's going on. It leaves a lot of empty space, and it didn't feel like that was a mistake or a flaw or a gap. It felt like a careful reinsertion of the mystical into the physics. I will also say the ghosts did remind me just a bit too much of the Canary Wharf incident in Doctor Who, which just made it feel a little bit silly to me. But I'm pretty sure that's a me problem, not a book problem. There were also some amazingly intense moments of dread with the ghosts that added a lot more depth even when I was picturing the Canary Wharf ghosts. But the complexity of how they work into the narrative is really fascinating. And, like, it's one of those things that you sort of know what's going on, and then you get to a moment in the book and you get clarity to what happened earlier, and you're like, okay, these connect to each other. I do also wonder how all of the incidents in this book would affect the future of this version of our world, which is one of those things that's both good, because it means I'm really invested, but it also means that I'm going to be a little bit mad if there's never any other books in this world. And I know that there is another Natasha Pulley book that is at least tangentially related. And, like, I don't necessarily need that book to be a direct sequel with these characters. But I at least want these characters to, like, be passing background characters so I know they're doing alright. Like, I don't know if I have anything else to say other than that just I really liked this book. It was fascinating, emotional, well-paced, and complexly told. The prose is fucking gorgeous. There are perfect moments of spot-on commentary, and those little lines that make you completely rethink something that has absolutely nothing to do with the book and is just, like, something connected in your life. And it's cute, but deep. It's poetic, but readable. It's relatable and human, but foreign and, like, magical. I just really loved this book.